be very controversial with many of you. In school, we are all taught the heliocentric model of our solar system. The heliocentric model is the one that we are all familiar with, where the sun is in the center of our solar system and all of the planets orbit around it. However, what you probably did not know is that mathematically speaking, the geocentric model is every bit as viable.
So is everything we know wrong?
Well, if the Copernican principle is wrong, then yes. Because as Bob said, everything is interpreted through that epistemological grid. And if that foundational assumption is wrong, then yes, our picture of the universe is fundamentally wrong. Now, the scientists will argue back and forth about this. They are very invested in a very successful model. But that model has a lot of patches in it. Dark matter, dark energy, these things have not been observationally confirmed. They believe they must be there because their formulas have gotten them so far, and so they'll plug in these other entities to make the equations work. But there is a strong and growing, very credible group of scientists who are beginning to question the Copernican principle. For example, we all learned about dark energy. Dark energy is causing the universe to accelerate its expansion. Well, George Ellis and a group that he works with, that we talk about in the film with, they said, wait a minute, let's just play with this for a second. Let's look at the world through a different view. Let's put Earth near the center, and let's get rid of the Copernican principle. Can we explain everything we see without dark energy? And the answer is yes, you can. And you will see many papers now in the peer-reviewed journals. They call it void cosmology. And the idea is that we're at the center of a void, and if we assume that the Earth is in that special non-Copernican position, we don't need dark energy to explain these observations. And that's big. That's big, because nobody has a clue what dark energy is.
Well, that's one of the things, Bob, isn't it? That it seems to me that, okay, so there's a big riddle here that, at least from the purely scientific point of view, there's this big riddle, and the riddle is, how does the universe work? Okay, at some point, you throw out a guess about some aspect of it, and then to support that guess, you have to come up with 3 more guesses. And to support those 3, they each spin off 10 more. Well, at what point do you get called on the fact, hey guys, every time you come up with one of these further guesses, you're further removed from anything observable.
Yeah.
But, it makes it on the cover of Time magazine, and the average Joe goes, ooh, dark matter. They have the slightest idea what that means. The guys hypothesizing it barely know what it means. So what does that say of the way I think everybody there's so many people in modern culture walk around with this like, ooh, science, wafting the incense at the altar of, and I mean, your point earlier, yeah, we know how a cell phone works and that's cool, but this stuff is so much theory and hypothesis and there's nothing to back it up. It's really kind of unscientific science.
Has there ever been an experiment done to prove that the Earth is revolving around the sun?
Yes, there was several experiments in the 1800s. Dominique Arago, Armand Fuseau, Augustin Fresnel, but one of the most famous was the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887.
Let's assume the ether frame moves relative to the Earth from left to right. Michelson-Morley used a half-silvered mirror to split a beam of light so that it travels in 2 different directions along 2 paths of equal length. This is the light beam before it is split. Moving in a perpendicular direction to the ether frame, this beam would be blown off course and would have to travel a little further. Traveling back down this path again, perpendicular to the ether, would also move this beam off course, if the ether existed. This beam, moving parallel to the ether and in the same direction, would increase its speed. This beam, again parallel to the ether, but moving in the opposite direction, would be slowed down. Here the 2 light beams are recombined together, and if they are in phase, they will constructively interfere. But if the speed was different in the 2 paths, they would combine to give an interference pattern.
No. Tell us about that.
Well, they used light beams to measure whether the Earth was moving, and they found that there was no movement. The Earth has to be moving 30 kilometers per second to complete its annual revolution. And they found out that it wasn't moving in a very precise. Michelson could have calculated it to 1/100th of what he got in his experiment. That's how sensitive his instruments were.
What did the experiment involve in terms of apparatus, so we can get a concrete understanding of
Well,
what they
if
found?
the Earth is moving around the sun and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay, and then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that, well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space, whereas this one that's going perpendicular would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south.
Okay.
Okay? And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity. And now you say, well, the reason that light beam wasn't affected when it went toward the motion of the Earth is because the apparatus shortened.
Huh?
Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened as it was going with the Earth in its orbit around the sun.
No, wait, you're telling me that the contraction of mass
Yes.
was invented to explain away the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment?
Yes, and that's what my book will tell you, and it's been admitted by all the scientists.
Well, isn't there any experimental confirmation that as you approach the speed of light, there's a contraction effect? The impression is that there's all kinds of experimental confirmation.
That was invented. There's no proof to it.
Really?
Yes, all the physicists will tell you there's no proof
Not
to
that
it.
I'm surprised, you understand.
Yeah.
I know what the scientific community is capable of in terms of mass deception. Evolution is a mass deception. But I wasn't aware that they don't really have any even purported scientific confirmation in terms of physical measurement.
No, nobody
of the contraction effect.
Nobody measured a contraction. But they put it into a mathematical formula called the Lorentz transform, and it's probably the most famous equation used in physics today.
Does anyone expressly admit that, hey, we had to come up with this contraction effect because otherwise we're stuck with a motionless
Yes,
Earth?
the very guy who invented it.
Tell me what
Heinrich
he
Lorentz.
admitted.
Heinrich Lorentz says, I don't have any other explanation to this experiment of Michelson-Morley unless I contract the apparatus. Otherwise, we're going to have to believe the Earth is standing still in space.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Can you give an approximate page reference for me to your book? I want to go back and read that right away.
I'll send you an email. I'll show you where it is.
If a telescope is pointing at a star, and both are stationary, then obviously the light comes straight into the telescope. In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However, there is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope. But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path, but is only travelling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further.
Here's another objection. If everything is moving, in other words, all the stars in the universe are moving, how could we possibly determine if we are the center of this moving universe?
Over the past decade or so, we have seen out to the very limits of the observable cosmos. We've mapped its largest structure, the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light in the universe according to the standard Big Bang model of cosmology. What we have discovered is shocking.
On the very largest scales, we see a pattern of really big hot and cold spots which line up around a special axis, which has been dubbed the axis of evil. And it's quite puzzling. Why is there a special direction in space?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you asked that, because in 2009 they set up a probe called the Planck probe. It just came back with the results in 2013 in March. I don't know if you heard about it or not.
No.
The European Space Agency set it up in cooperation with NASA. This was the third attempt that they had to nullify the data that they were finding in the cosmic microwave background radiation that permeates the whole universe, that the Earth was in the center of the universe. The first one they set up was in 1990 called the COBE probe. It came back, showed the Earth was in the center. The WMAP was the second one in 2001, came back with the same data. And what they tried to do was say that this was all an error. It was some kind of misreading, or it was, there was contamination in the apparatus or the sky or whatever. So they sent up a third probe in 2009, just came back in 2013. Guess what? Same exact results. Same exact results. And what were the interpretations? Well, the Earth has to be in the center of the universe. And we have somebody quoted in our book, Lawrence Krauss of the Arizona State University, who says, yeah, this means we're in the center of the universe.
Let's pick up on that point a bit. You mentioned that the background radiation, microwave radiation in the universe, supplied data from which it became apparent that the Earth was in fact at the center of a moving universe. Explain why that is so. Why do these data confirm that?
Okay. Well, the Big Bang Theory predicts that there was an explosion 13.7 billion years ago. Okay? So if there was an explosion, then that means the explosion had to come out equal on all sides of the sphere. It had to be what they call homogeneous. Okay? And that's naturally accepted. It's like homogenized milk.
Sure.
You know, you shake that thing up and you can't see one place from another place. It's all homogenized. And that's what they needed for this Big Bang universe. What they found when they sent these three probes up, yeah, some of it was homogeneous, but it's like having a bowl full of Jell-O with two swords going through the middle of the Jell-O.
What are the swords?
The swords are the orientation of the cosmic microwave background radiation throughout the universe.
What do you mean by the orientation?
Okay, there's hot and cold spots they found. It's not homogeneous. There's hot and cold spots in this microwave background radiation, and if you align all these cold spots, it forms an X through the whole universe.
Unbelievable.
And guess what's in the middle?
Oh, you're kidding.
No.
This is what the data shows.
This is what the data shows.
Okay, come on now. What mainstream publication recognizes
The
this?
University of Michigan, Dragon Hutterer, Craig Copey, Glenn Starkman. These are all the guys who have done all the work on this microwave radiation. They write it in their papers. They wrote one in 2004, 2008, 2010, and 2012, and they're writing another one on the Planck probe.
So you're saying these space probes were designed to explain away the X represented by the hot and cold spots?
They wanted to make sure it wasn't an accident.
Okay, so there were how many probes in total?
3 in 20 years.
And you're saying that all 3 confirmed what then?
That the Earth is in the center of the universe.
On the basis of the hot and cold spots?
Yes.
Whose alignment represents an X.
An X.
And at the center of the X is the Earth.
Right, and they call that X the axis of evil. That was coined.
Scientists call that the axis of evil.
Called it the axis of evil. That was coined in 2004 when Bush went into Iraq. Remember, he called them the axis of evil? So this cosmologist just picked it up and said, yeah, well, here's the axis of evil right here. in the universe.
So, in other words, they're enraged by the finding.
Oh, yeah.
Because it upsets their worldview, which
Yeah.
has to displace the Earth's special position in the universe,
Yeah.
which fits in rather nicely with a divinely created universe,
Right.
made for man.
All of cosmology is based on what we call the Copernican principle. Every piece of data that they get in their telescope has to be filtered through the Copernican principle. And that's what the Big Bang Theory does, NASA does it, ESA does it, everybody does it. The upsetting thing about this microwave radiation is it just totally defies the Copernican principle.
The last probe confirmed that as well, you say?
The last probe, yeah. As a matter of fact,
where was that result reported? Obviously everywhere, but give me some examples.
March 21st in the European Space Agency report. As a matter of fact, it's in our movie.
What's their attempt to explain the latest probe's findings away?
Anomalies.
Anomalies?
Mm-hmm.
And all the anomalies conveniently line up in a non-anomalous way to verify their model.
Right.
This is amazing. So this brings us to the question of motive. We've been hinting at it throughout the discussion. There's obviously a motive at work here. Many people have recognized, not just believers, not just Catholics, but people like David Berlinski, for example, that science has become an ideology. Maybe you could take up that theme as we close out this interview.
Yeah.
Isn't there an ideological component?
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say it's a religion. Science is a religion today. It's scientism. And they've already got the parameters within which they want to interpret the data, and they're not going to go outside those parameters. This is a perfect example. You do get some of them that break out of it, and they say, yeah, well, this defies the Copernican principle. We've read many papers like that, and we quote them in our book. Okay? But the motivation is, if the Copernican principle is wrong, that means all of science is wrong. Everything, cosmogony, paleontology, cosmology, archaeology, everything now becomes suspect because we can't support these long ages. We can't support this vast universe. As a matter of fact, we're in the center of it. How does that happen? Well, it's not going to happen by chance. Someone had to put it there, you see, and that's what they're scared of. That's the motivation.
Let's say we just use modern science, just for the sake of argument. Let's say we use Einstein's general relativity, invented in 1915. Well, Einstein's general relativity said there's no difference between an Earth fixed in the universe and the universe going around it, as opposed to the universe remaining fixed and the Earth rotating. Those two are equivalent. Why? Because everything's relative in general relativity, you see. So modern science can't refute the idea. It was Einstein, Mach, Bohr. I mean, you go down all the prominent scientists of the day, they all agreed, yeah, there's no way we can refute that. The universe can go around the Earth, or the Earth can rotate inside a fixed universe. Which one is true, they can't tell us. You see, that's the key point here. They can't tell us. Science can only go so far.
Right.
And then you have revelation, you see.
Yes.
And revelation fills the gap.
Absolutely.
Okay?
You know, it's interesting when you think about, okay, you know, if we are, I'll borrow the prop myself. So here we are, assuming in the studio that the studio is the universe. We're on here looking out. And how do we know? I mean, if this is moving versus that's moving.
Very good point.
Yeah.
This is the key.
You're the fish in the aquarium. So how can you be in the aquarium and make an observation from outside the aquarium? You're in it.
What a brilliant observation, Michael. And you put your finger on it. Because one of the interesting things about this film is that 500 years ago, you were crazy if you thought the Earth was rotating on its axis. 500 years later, you're crazy if you think it isn't. I guarantee you the universe hasn't changed, right? So what has changed is our view. In other words, oh, you're crazy to think, no, I'm afraid that's not going to work. Because physics itself had to reinvent itself at the beginning of the 20th century by Albert Einstein because they couldn't measure that assumed motion of the Earth around the sun. One of the more interesting parts of our film is that experiment, that 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment, where they could not measure what they were sure was happening. So you have two doors. You have door number one. Well, maybe it ain't moving around the sun. Can't have that.
Right.
Door number two is we get to reinvent physics from the ground up.
Again.
And we have to say, yes, we have to say, no experiment can detect absolute motion. All physics can do is describe relative motion. And Einstein even says, it's a quote in our book, it is equally valid under relativity to talk about the Earth motionless at the center and the universe rotating around it, or the Earth rotating on its axis and the universe being steady.
So there you have it, guys. The geocentric model of our universe is equally, if not more so, plausible as the heliocentric model. Now, so far in this video, we have addressed the basics of creationism and the basics of geocentrism. But now we're really going to get into the hard-hitting, missing element of this whole theory.
If I were to ask you, or any random person, who was the most brilliant man of the modern era, what would be the answer? The answer, of course, for most people would be Albert Einstein. He is viewed as the man who changed mathematics and the way we perceive the universe. Most of the now widely accepted work in higher mathematics after Einstein was based on his theories. What if I were to tell you that there was another man that lived when Einstein did? A man who accomplished more than Einstein could dream of. A man who challenged all the theories Einstein proposed. A man whom Einstein actually agreed with in 1920. But this fact seems to go largely unnoticed. This man has been accused of all sorts of things. He was accused of everything from being a mad scientist to being some kind of wizard, and was seen as a heretic to modern science and mathematics. This man is someone whom science wanted to forget, and whom all bankers of the time cut off funding to. This man died penniless and alone, with only pigeons to keep him company. One of his last projects was a new theory of gravity. According to FBI documents acquired via the Freedom of Information Act request, the sum of this man's possessions consisted of about 2 truckloads of material and approximately 30 barrels and bundles, which were seized upon his death in 1943 by agents of the now defunct Office of Alien Property Custodian. One document states that it is reported to have some 80 trunks in different places containing transcripts and plans having to do with experiments. This man's research was seen as so dangerous that it has never been declassified by the government. This man was a physicist with more formal training in the field than Albert Einstein, who was a patent clerk. This man had a photographic memory and spoke 6 languages. He showed genius at an early age and was able to perform integral calculus in his head, though his teachers thought him to be cheating. Did he accomplish anything with this genius? This one man invented radio, AC power, which is used worldwide today, laser, radar, X-ray, wireless communication, particle beam weaponry, wireless electricity, cellular technology, the electron microscope, microwave technology, hydroelectric generators, neon lights, fluorescent lights, brushless synchronous and induction motors, bladeless turbine and pump, remote control, electronic robotics, just to name a few. He predicted things like the BlackBerry in 1909. Before the 1900s, he demonstrated remote control boats. Who was this man? Nikola Tesla. Why was this man so dangerous? Tesla said things like this about Einstein's work. It is a magnificent mathematical garb which fascinates, dazzles, and makes people blind to the underlying errors. The theory is like a beggar, clothed in purple, whom ignorant people take for a king. Its exponents are brilliant men, but they are metaphysicists, meaning they deal with the supernatural, rather than scientists. Supposing that the bodies act upon the surrounding space, causing curving of the same, it appears to my simple mind that the curved spaces must react on the bodies, and producing the opposite effects, straightening out the curves. Since action and reaction are coexistent, it follows that the supposed curvature of space is entirely impossible. But even if it existed, it would not explain the motions of the bodies as observed. Only the existence of a field of force can account for the motions of bodies as observed, and its assumption dispenses with space curvature. All literature on this subject is futile and destined to oblivion. So are all attempts to explain the workings of the universe without recognizing the existence of the ether and the indispensable function it plays in the phenomena. My second discovery was a physical truth of the greatest importance. As I have searched in the entire scientific records in more than a half a dozen languages for a long time without finding the least anticipation, I consider myself the original discoverer of this truth, which can be expressed by this statement: there is no energy in matter other than that received from the environment. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. Now, what is the ether? Some think of it as a firmament, which our universe exists within. Yes, just like the firmament spoken of in the Bible book of Genesis. Tesla said a good example for such an interaction becomes apparent in gravitation, which should rather be named universal compression. I think the material bodies do not gravitate between each other, but it is the ether that makes one material body to press to another. We wrongly call this phenomenon gravitation. The stars, planets, and all the universe appeared from the ether, when some part of it, due to certain reasons, became less dense.
Now, the idea that everything is connected is a very old idea. Even in science, in the late 1800s, there was a belief that there was an invisible web of energy that connects everything in the 1800s. And scientists were in a very heated debate, very controversial, as to whether or not this field exists. There was a very famous experiment that was conducted to determine if the field called the ether field actually existed. In the year 1887, the very famous Michelson-Morley experiment was designed to tell once and for all, is the field here or no? Yes or no? The field exists? It does not exist. In my opinion, it was a good experiment. However, it was poorly interpreted. For over 100 years, our science has been based in a belief that is incorrect. It's incorrect. Now, this is very interesting. 100 years later, 1986, the United States Air Force repeated that experiment. 1986, the United States Air Force replicated the Michelson-Morley experiment. They published the results in the very prestigious journal Nature, the scientific journal Nature. What they found was this. They repeated the experiment with good equipment, much better equipment. The bottom line is that the field exists. They found that the field is actually there. This is reported in August 1986, the journal Nature, volume 322. They said, the field is there. And not only is the field there, it measured precisely the way that Michelson and Morley had predicted 100 years earlier. They just didn't have the equipment to work this out. Now, why don't we know about this? This should have made the cover of every major magazine and newspaper. This should have been on CNN headline news or Sky News. But this changes everything for the scientists, because the textbooks all say the field is not there. Entire careers are based on the field not being there. And now the field is there.
Einstein's theories were based on the non-existence of the ether. What is not presented much in media is that Einstein himself doubted his theories on multiple occasions. In 1920 he said, "But on the other hand, there is a weighty argument to be adduced in favor of the ether hypothesis. To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical quality whatsoever. The fundamental facts of quantum mechanics do not harmonize with this view. Recapitulating, we may say that according to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable. For in such space, there not only would be no propagation of light, but also no possibility of existence for standards of space and time, measuring rods and clocks, nor therefore any space-time intervals in the physical sense. Media presents the idea of Einstein-based mathematics as fact. We are told that this is concrete and that the entire scientific community is in total agreement. This could not be farther from the truth. In fact, calling it mathematics at all is misleading. These are theories with no absolutes. There are two divided camps, one that believes there is an ether and one that doesn't. All we are presented with on television is the theories that rely on no ether existing and then replacing the ether with things like dark matter to try to make all the theories work. So what is modern science? The belief in theories based on a man who doubted his own theories, which incorporate dark matter, which these scientists are not even sure exists. What am I trying to say here? Science does not give you or have all the answers. When you hang on every word of people like Stephen Hawking, know that there are many people whom are just as brilliant who completely disagree with them.
We must first understand the current theory of gravity and its problems before we go further towards other theories, so let's take 1 minute to do just that. The most widely accepted theory of gravity right now is Einstein's general theory of relativity. Although the mathematics in this theory are founded upon very complicated equations involving tensors, ultimately the actual mechanism and physics of how gravity is formed is just that mass, somehow through unexplainable means, using no energy or momentum, interacts with interwoven space and time, curving it around mass. Space and time is just simply standard three-dimensional space, with a fourth dimension being change in that space, or time. The problems with this view of gravity are numerous. As per calculations, the majority of mass in the galaxy must be undetectable dark matter, or else the galaxies would not be able to hold together as they do at the measured speeds of rotation around their galactic core. Also, there must be another undetectable force named dark energy, which is facilitating the measured expansion of the galaxies moving away from each other equally in all directions, something is impossible in all current theories of gravity. Also, closer to home, the perihelion precession, which is basically just a slight shifting of planetary orbits over time, cannot be completely explained with Einstein's equations of general relativity. Although the math of general relativity greatly increased the calculated accuracy of these events, another undiscovered planet expected to be roughly the size of Jupiter must be orbiting our Sun to account for the remaining inconsistencies. Yet Einstein's general theory of relativity is proven correct in many other ways time and time again, or has it? Right now, let's go over this new theory of dynamic gravity and see if it can explain gravity better. First, though, we have to understand that magnetic fields are facilitated by virtual photons, and magnetic fields can interact with each other. Forcing two similar poles of a magnet together will cause the fields to repel each other, creating force. And when two equally sized magnets are combined so that the opposite poles combine, the end result is not a magnetic field twice the strength, only larger by the size of the magnet, but rather a field that, while stronger, has also been displaced out slightly further and larger than it was previously. So what do magnets have to do with gravity? Maybe a lot more than you think. The electromagnetic force is a fundamental force that binds a proton and electron together. And it also creates magnetic fields when large clusters of atoms located in specific areas of the periodic table have a charge from electrons in the valence electron shell. But let's forget about magnetic fields, since a magnetic field is clearly not gravity. But a new force that would act as gravity does, and we will hereafter call gravity, is created when atoms of molecules are forced tightly together, encroaching their separate electromagnetic force fields, which are facilitated by virtual photons. The fields are displaced in similar fashion to encroaching magnetic fields, particularly under the immense pressure and heat found at the core of celestial bodies. Once a critical limit is reached, the effect would grow exponentially, which would allow the electromagnetic force to reach vast distances and remain exceptionally strong. And this displaced force would pull and attract all electrons, particularly the ones found in the outer orbital shells and atoms. Almost all physical matter contains electrons, hence almost all matter would be drawn to the source of this displaced field, exerting force pulling the electrons, but not enough to break them away from their orbital positions and away from their parent protons. Two separate electromagnetic forces will be exerted on the electrons simultaneously. The end result will be a net force exerted on the entire atom as a whole towards the source of the external electromagnetic field, and of course pitting electrons into seemingly chaotic orbital paths, contributing to the mystery of the electron cloud. However, there is at least one known particle of matter that does not contain an electron, the unpaired proton. The sole particle that is so unstable that its weight must still be deduced from the measured weight of hydrogen. According to the dynamic theory of gravity, this particle would not fall in the gravitational field and would hence be quite unstable in the gravitational field, eventually making its way free of the planet into space as hydrogen and helium eventually do. But there is more to this theory than a simple attractive force. As the name dynamic gravity implies, there are opposing forces. Not only is there the attractive nature of this force pulling towards it all negative entities in the electromagnetic force, the electrons, but because the cores of celestial bodies are generating enormous gravitational fields associated with the positive force of the electromagnetic force from the protons, it would then be expected that celestial bodies would not only pull themselves together, they would also repel, ensuring that celestial bodies would never, under normal circumstances, collide once they have reached a certain size. This repulsive field could, under certain circumstances, like galactic black hole cores, could completely attribute to the force currently known as dark energy.
Newton's apple does not fall to the ground because of the downward force of gravity, but because of the upward momentum of electromagnetic radiation, or light. Gravity is not a real force at all. It is a secondary force to electromagnetic force. Objects just free fall towards the greatest energy because it has the slowest rate of time, or the greatest time dilation. I believe this can be seen in the mathematics, with both the gravitational force and the electromagnetic force having the inverse square law. We have the inverse square law because the surface area of the light sphere increases with the square of the radius. Thus the strength of the gravitational field is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source. There is no mysterious action at a distance. The gravitational field will work at the speed of light because it is an integral part of one universal process with the electromagnetic force. We have one universal process that begins with the quantum wave particle function, or probability function of quantum mechanics, expanding out as an inverse sphere, and ends with the inverse square law of gravity and Newton's third law of motion. To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Gravity is the opposite reaction to the atoms radiating quantized spherical wavefronts of electromagnetic radiation. We have one interactive, universal process continuously unfolding at the quantum level of the atoms. We see and feel this process as time, as a physical process of continuous energy exchange that is formed light-photon oscillation by light-photon oscillation. Objects form their own time by slowing up the rate that time flows, relative to their energy and momentum. Gravity is not a real force at all. Objects just free fall towards the greatest energy because it has the greatest time dilation, or the slowest rate the time flows. In this theory, mass is a byproduct of time dilation. When time slows down, it takes more effort to move an object from A to B, and this is seen as an increase in mass. Also, Einstein's equivalence principle between gravity and acceleration falls out of this theory. Because energy and momentum have to increase for an object to accelerate, time dilation will increase relative to the acceleration. Therefore, we have the equivalence principle between gravity and acceleration. This will be felt as inertia in the direction of the acceleration. Therefore, we have Isaac Newton's first law of motion. Unless acted upon by a net unbalanced force, an object will maintain a constant velocity. This theory takes the dynamic interactive process of the general theory of relativity and extends it to our everyday life, explaining a universe that is continuously coming into existence relative to the energy and momentum of our own actions. Every individual is a part of this interactive process that forms the uncertainty and probability that is needed for the great game of life. But above all, this theory gives us an objective understanding of time as a process of continuous creation. Even a rose blooming will create its own arrow of time within its own reference frame.
Now, the reason that was such a breakthrough for me in my research is because, as you heard at the end there, Nikola Tesla's dynamic theory of gravity implies a direct correlation to electromagnetic radiation, aka light, and gravity, along with time itself. This is huge, but real quick,